There's a specific kind of silence that only exists inside the cab of a long-haul rig when the sun's been down for 10 hours and the rain is turning the world into a gray, blurred memory. You'd think the engine would be loud enough to drown it out, but it isn't. You can feel the silence sitting in the passenger seat, heavy and expectant, just waiting for you to blink long enough for it to take the wheel. I was crossing the Cascades, hauling 40,000 pounds of refrigerated meat. The road was a winding ribbon of black glass, and the rain was coming down in sheets that made my headlights feel useless. I was pushing my hours, I knew that. My eyes were burning, that grit behind the eyeballs feeling that tells you your brain is starting to misfire. Then the high beams caught a flash of white on the shoulder. It wasn't a deer, it was a woman. She was standing perfectly still in the downpour, wearing a floral Sunday dress that looked soaked through to her skin. She didn't have an umbrella, she didn't have a coat. She was just holding a small wicker picnic basket and waving, a slow, rhythmic motion of her hand, like she was greeting a neighbor over a white picket fence. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I had, every story I'd heard over the CB radio for 20 years, told me to keep my foot on the gas, but she looked so much like my own mother, small, frail, with white hair plastered to her skull by the storm. I hit the air brakes. The rig hissed and groaned as it came to a stop a few yards ahead of her. I opened the door, and the cold mountain air rushed in, smelling of pine and wet earth. "Ma'am," I shouted over the rain, "what are you doing out here? You're gonna freeze." She didn't answer right away. She climbed up the steps with a surprising, jerky quickness, her movements like a bird's. When she sat in the passenger seat, she didn't shiver. She just set that wicker basket on her lap and smoothed out her wet dress. "I'm going to the bridge, dear," she said. Her voice was thin and high, like wind whistling through a cracked window. "Just a little further up the road. You're such a kind boy to stop for an old woman." I pulled back onto the road, my heart thumping a bit too fast. I tried to make small talk, the way you do to keep yourself awake. I asked her where she lived, if she had family nearby. She just kept staring straight through the windshield, her hands clutching the handle of that basket. Her knuckles were white, not just pale, but the color of bleached bone. "My boys are waiting for me at the bridge," she whispered. "They're so hungry. It's been a long season, and the cellar is empty." I looked over at her, and that's when I noticed the first thing that was truly wrong. The heater was blasting at full strength. My cab was probably 75 degrees, but the water on her dress wasn't drying. In fact, it wasn't even dripping off her. It was pulsing. The wet floral fabric seemed to be moving, shifting against her skin as if something underneath was trying to find a way out. And then there was the smell. It hit me all at once. It wasn't the smell of rain. It was the smell of a stagnant pond. It was the scent of something that had been underwater for a very, very long time. "Are you all right, ma'am?" I asked, my hand drifting toward the door handle. She turned her head to look at me. She didn't turn it like a person does. Her shoulders stayed perfectly still, but her neck twisted nearly 90 degrees with a sound like dry sticks snapping. She wasn't wearing a floral dress. As my eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the dashboard, I realized the flowers on the fabric were actually hundreds of tiny, translucent moths, their wings pinned to her gray, bloated skin. They were shivering in unison, creating the illusion of a pattern. "We're almost there, Caleb," she said. "My name isn't Caleb." I opened my mouth to tell her that, but my throat felt like it was filled with silt. "The bridge is just around the bend," she continued. She began to open the wicker basket on her lap. "Would you like to see what I brought for my boys? They've been waiting for a driver just like you, someone with a big heart, a big beating heart." She reached into the basket and pulled out a rusted set of heavy-duty sewing needles and a spool of what looked like human hair. I looked back at the road, terrified. But the road was gone. The asphalt had turned into a narrow wooden pier that stretched out into a black, bottomless lake. My headlights didn't hit trees or guardrails anymore. They just hit an endless rising mist. I slammed on the brakes, but the pedal went straight to the floor. The rig wasn't stopping, it was accelerating. The old woman leaned over, her face stretching, the skin on her cheeks tearing open to reveal rows of needle-thin teeth. She didn't look like a mother anymore. She looked like a deep-sea nightmare that had crawled into a dress. "Don't struggle, dear," she hissed, bringing the long needle up to my face. "I need to stitch your eyes shut first. My boys don't like it when the cargo looks back at them." The last thing I saw before the needle pierced the skin of my eyelid was the bridge. It wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was made of dozens of rusted semi-trucks, piled one on top of the other, forming a path into the dark, and they were all empty. There's a stretch of Interstate 80 in Nebraska that truckers call the Black Hole. It's a 60-mile span where the cell towers vanish, the GPS spins in circles, and the radio dial becomes a graveyard of white noise and static. Usually you just pop in a podcast or a CD and white-knuckle it until you see the lights of the next flying J. But last night, the static started to change. I was hauling a dry van of electronics, pushing through a thick, freezing drizzle. I had the radio on low, just for the company of the noise. When the sharp hiss of the static smoothed out, it turned into a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heavy heart beating inside the dashboard. I reached over to turn the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The digital display was stuck on 0.0 FM. That's impossible. Radios don't start at 0. Then a voice broke through. It wasn't a DJ or a weather report. It was the voice of an old woman. It was sweet, trembling, and sounded exactly like my grandmother used to sound when she was reading me a bedtime story. Warm, but with a strange, underlying coldness that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Welcome back to the long haul, Elias," she said. "My name is Elias. You're making good time tonight. Too good, perhaps. You should slow down. The bridge at mile marker 114 is feeling brittle." Pause. I let off the accelerator. My heart was hammered against my ribs. There was no way a local station knew my name. There was no way a broadcast was targeting my specific rig. I grabbed the CB mic, ready to ask if anyone else was hearing this, but the CB was dead. No hiss, no chatter, just silence. "Don't bother with the radio, dear," the old woman's voice came back, clearer now. "Nobody can hear you but me. I'm the one who keeps the records. I'm the one who counts the miles." Then I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was the sound of a tea kettle whistling and the slow, rhythmic creak, creak, creak of a rocking chair. It It sounded like she was sitting right there in the sleeper berth behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror. The back of the cab was dark, but for a split second, I saw the glow of a radio dial reflected in a pair of glasses. A pair of glasses that weren't mine. "I have a request tonight," she continued. "A song for a man who didn't check his brake lines in Cheyenne. A song for a man who thinks he's alone in the dark." Suddenly, the speakers didn't play music. They played the sound of a metal-on-metal collision, the screech of tearing steel, the sound of glass shattering in slow motion. And over the top of it, the old woman began to hum, a low, tuneless melody that vibrated through the steering wheel. I looked at the digital clock on the dash. It was counting backward. 3:14, 3:13, 3:12. "Do you want to see the studio, Elias?" she asked. Her voice dropped an octave, losing that grandmotherly sweetness. It became raspy, like sand being poured over wet meat. "It's just over the next rise. Look to your left. The house with the red porch light." I looked. In the middle of a barren cornfield, where there shouldn't have been anything for miles, sat a tiny, dilapidated shack. A single red bulb burned on the porch. Standing under that light was the old woman. She wasn't holding a microphone. She was holding a heavy, old-fashioned telephone handset, and the cord went straight into the ground. She was staring at my truck as I flew past at 70 miles per hour. Even at that distance, I could see her mouth moving in perfect sync with the words coming out of my speakers. "You missed your exit, Elias," she hissed. The radio display suddenly changed. It didn't say 0.0 anymore. It said ETA 0001. I looked back at the road, and my headlights hit something that shouldn't have been there. It was my own truck, not a truck like mine. It was my rig, with my license plate flipped over in the middle of the highway, wheels still spinning. The radio gave one final, wet cackle. "Don't worry, dear," the old woman whispered, her voice now coming from the speaker directly behind my left ear. "I'll stay on the air with you all the way down." I slammed on the brakes, but the cab didn't slow. I felt the steering wheel go limp in my hands. The world began to tilt. The radio started playing the sound of my own screaming, recorded and looped over and over again. There is a wall you hit when you've been behind the wheel for 24 hours straight. Your vision starts to fray at the edges like an old VHS tape. The white lines on the road start to look like silver snakes slithering under your tires, and the hum of the engine stops being a sound and starts being a conversation. I was hauling a load of dry goods through the Nebraska Panhandle. My logbook was a work of fiction, and my eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead. I knew I should pull over, but every rest stop I passed was either full or boarded up. Then, just as the clock hit the 25th hour of wakefulness, I saw it. Pearl's Pit Stop, home cooking for the long haul. The neon sign was a vibrant, pulsing pink that seemed to cut right through the fog. It wasn't on my GPS. It wasn't on the paper map tucked in the door pocket. It just appeared, nestled in a valley that had been empty darkness seconds before. I pulled the rig in. The parking lot was paved with gravel that didn't crunch when I drove over it. It was silent, dead silent. There were 3 other rigs parked there, old models, the kind with round headlights and rusted chrome that you don't see on the road anymore. I climbed out of the cab. The air didn't smell like the plains. It smelled like Sunday dinner, pot roast, mashed potatoes, and cinnamon. It was a smell so thick it felt like I was breathing in a blanket. I pushed open the glass door of the diner. A bell chimed, but the sound didn't ring. It just thudded and died. "Well, look at you," a voice said. Behind the counter stood an old woman. She was tiny, with a beehive of snow-white hair and an apron that was so clean it looked like it was glowing. She was Pearl. She had a smile that reminded me of my favorite aunt, but her eyes were different. They were the color of a bruised plum, and they didn't seem to have pupils. "You look tuckered out, Caleb," she said. I didn't even bother correcting her about my name. I was too tired to care. I sat down on a swivel stool. The vinyl was warm, as if someone had just left, but the diner was empty. "I just need coffee, Pearl. Black, strong enough to melt the spoon," I muttered. She chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, no coffee, honey. Not for you. You've done enough work. What you need is a big plate of my special rest-easy stew and a nice long nap in the back room." She set a bowl in front of me. It was steaming, smelling of rich beef and herbs. I picked up the spoon, but as I moved to take a bite, I noticed something. The steam wasn't rising, it was falling. It was flowing over the edges of the bowl and pooling on the counter like a heavy gas. I looked around the diner again. On the far wall, there was a row of those missing person flyers you see at every truck stop. I squinted. The faces on the flyers weren't strangers. They were the drivers of the 3 rusted rigs sitting out in the lot. And in the very last slot, there was a fresh flyer. It was a picture of me. Not a grainy photo, but a clear, high-definition shot of me sitting right here at this counter, looking at the flyer. "Eat up, Caleb," Pearl whispered. She was leaning over the counter now. Her skin was starting to sag, sliding off her cheekbones like melting wax. "The boys in the back are getting lonely. They haven't had a new story to listen to in years." I dropped the spoon. It didn't clatter. It sank into the counter as if the wood had turned into quicksand. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt like they were made of water. I looked down at my hands. They were turning gray. The color was draining out of my skin and flowing into the floorboards. Pearl reached across and took my hand. Her touch wasn't skin on skin. It felt like cold, wet paper. "You're so tired, aren't you?" she cooed. Her mouth opened, and I realized she didn't have any teeth, just rows of jagged, calcified ridges. "Just close your eyes. The road is gone. The load is delivered. You're home now." I looked toward the back of the diner, where a heavy velvet curtain hung over a doorway. The curtain moved, and a hand reached out. It was a human hand, but it was translucent, and the fingernails had been replaced with rusted sewing needles. I realized then that the stew wasn't food. I looked into the bowl and saw a single human eye staring back at me from the gravy. It blinked. It was the same color as mine. I found a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. I lunged backward, falling off the stool. The moment my back hit the floor, the diner vanished. I wasn't in a diner. I was sitting in the middle of the highway, my truck idling 50 yards away, half rolled into a ditch. There was no neon sign, no gravel lot, just the empty howling wind of the Nebraska plains. But as I scrambled back to my rig, my heart hammering in my throat, I reached into my pocket for my keys. My hand hit something cold and wet. I pulled it out. It was a sprig of fresh parsley, dripping with a thick, savory brown gravy that smelled exactly like pot roast. And from the darkness of the cornfield to my left, I heard a thin, high-pitched cackle. "Come back soon, Caleb. You still owe me for the bowl." I needed a night shift job bad. I stood there, shivering in the dead-eye chill of a Tuesday midnight, staring at that ATM screen like it was a holy relic. The machine was old, one of those clunky, off-brand ones in the back of a 24-hour bodega, and it was humming. A low, electrical thrum that I could feel in the soles of my sneakers. The green neon text was flickering, just a tiny bit, sending a rhythmic, nauseating pulse into the dark. Balance, $7.42. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just watched that blinking cursor, feeling the lump in my throat grow until it felt like a stone. Rent was due in 72 hours. My landlord, a guy who smelled like stale cigarettes and took a perverse pleasure in reminding people of their legal obligations. He wasn't the type for extensions. I could practically hear my dad's voice on the other end of a phone call I hadn't made yet. That heavy, saturated sigh. The long silence before he'd say, "Again, Leo, truly." That tone. The one that makes you feel 6 inches tall. I couldn't call him. I'd rather starve. I turned away from the machine, the bodega's bell chiming with a tinny mocking sound as I stepped back out onto the street. The campus was a ghost town. The street lamps were casting these long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and pull at the edges of my vision. I found myself walking toward the community board near the library, a massive, cork-covered wall layered with months of rotting paper and forgotten dreams. I was looking for anything: plasma donation, clinical trials, night shifts at the warehouse. But then I saw it. It wasn't buried under the others. It was pinned right at eye level, a fresh, crisp sheet of white paper with jagged hand-drawn black text that seemed to vibrate under the sodium light. Sitter wanted. 1 night only. Remote location. $500 cash. Inquire within. $500 for 1 night. It was an impossible number, a too-good-to-be-true number. My gut, that little voice that usually keeps me out of trouble, it gave a sharp, cold tug in my chest. But when you're down to $7, you don't listen to your gut. You silence it. You tell it to shut up so you can eat. I pulled my phone out. My fingers were so cold they felt like wooden dowels, and I dialed the number. I expected a machine. I expected a scam. Instead, it picked up on the first half ring. The man who answered, Mr. Ullman, he didn't sound like a local. He sounded like a ghost from a 1940s radio broadcast. His voice was deep, impossibly cultured, and smooth, too smooth, like he was reading a script he'd memorized a century ago. He didn't ask for references. He didn't ask about my major or my background. He just asked one thing, his voice dropping into a low, resonant hum. Do you have a reliable vehicle, Leo? And are you a young man who appreciates the sanctity of absolute silence? I told him I'd be there by 10. I didn't even ask what I was sitting for. I was too busy calculating how many boxes of ramen $800 could buy. The drive took nearly an hour, though it felt like I was traveling through different centuries rather than just miles. I watched the gas stations and the glowing neon of fast food joints fade away, replaced by the deep suffocating wall of the pines. My rusted Honda felt smaller out here. The engine's rattle, which usually felt like a familiar comfort, now sounded thin, vulnerable against the immense, pressurized silence of the back roads. The GPS had given up somewhere near the county line, leaving me to follow a set of handwritten directions that seemed to lead me deeper into a place where the trees leaned over the asphalt like skeletal fingers, their branches scraping against the roof of my car with a sound like long fingernails on a chalkboard. Then the house appeared. It didn't just sit on the land, it loomed over it. It was a Victorian monstrosity, a jagged architectural scar against the moonlight. It was all sharp peaks, blackened wood, and narrow, staring windows that looked like rows of dead eyes. There was a turret on the left side that pierced the night sky, and a wraparound porch that seemed to be receding into the shadows. I parked my car in the gravel driveway, the sound of the stones crunching beneath my tires, feeling violent, intrusive, in a place that seemed to be holding its breath. I sat there for a second, my hand on the keys, watching the house. There were no lights on in the windows, just a solid, impenetrable blackness. I stepped out, and the air hit me. It wasn't just cold, it was sterile. It didn't smell like the woods, it smelled like nothing. The front door creaked open before my foot even touched the top step. Mr. Ullman was waiting. He was tall, impossibly tall, and he stood in the frame with a posture that was so perfectly straight it felt unnatural. He was wearing a dark three-piece suit that looked expensive, but the cut was from another era entirely. Beside him stood his wife. She wore a high-collared black dress, her hands folded neatly in front of her. But it was her face that made the hair on my arms stand up. Her hair was pulled back so tightly into a bun that it seemed to stretch the skin of her forehead, pulling her eyes into a wide, unblinking stare. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a perfect expression, the kind of look someone might practice in a mirror for hours, a masterpiece of the uncanny valley. "Leo," Mr. Ullman said. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to resonate in the floorboards beneath my feet. "You are punctual, a rare trait in the modern world. Please, come into the warmth." The foyer was a museum of the bizarre. The walls were covered in heavy, dark velvet drapes that swallowed the light from the dim chandelier, and everywhere I looked there were eyes. Taxidermy heads, deer, foxes, things I couldn't quite name, stared down from the walls with glass eyes that seemed to track my every movement. The air inside was thick with the scent of beeswax, lavender, and that faint metallic tang I couldn't place, like old pennies. "So," I said, my voice sounding thin and shaky in the vast hall, "where's the kid? You mentioned a sitting job." The room went cold. Mrs. Ullman's smile didn't falter, but her head tilted just a fraction of an inch to the side, a movement that was too smooth, too mechanical. "Ah," Mr. Ullman replied, clasping his hands behind his back. "A slight adjustment of expectations, Leo. There is no child. It is my wife's mother. She resides in the attic room. She is very old and very, very unwell. She requires absolute, unbroken silence for her rest. You won't see her. You won't hear her. We simply require a presence in the house while we attend our private engagement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He fanned it open just enough for me to see the hundreds. 500, as promised, he whispered, and another 300 for your discretion, for your silence. $800. I could pay the rent. I could buy groceries that weren't in a box. I could breathe again. I looked at the money, then at the dark, winding staircase that led up into the shadows of the second floor. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get back in the Honda and never look back. But the weight of that $7.42 in my bank account was heavier than my fear. I took the envelope. I'll stay, I said. Mrs. Ullman's smile widened just a fraction, and for a split second I thought I saw her eyes flash with something that wasn't joy. It was hunger. Part 3. The Pulse of the House. Narration style. Heavy-limbed, disoriented, building into a breathless panic. The sound of their car fading away. It was the loneliest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't just silence. It was a vacuum, a pressurized, heavy stillness that seemed to push against my eardrums until they throbbed with the rhythm of my own blood. I stood in the center of that foyer, clutching the envelope of cash, feeling the weight of the house settling onto my shoulders. Every floorboard I stepped on emitted a sharp, dry crack that echoed up into the dark rafters like a gunshot. I retreated to the den, sinking into the stiff leather sofa, trying to focus on my textbook. But the air in the room felt thin, as if the house were slowly breathing all the oxygen out of the space. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The grandfather clock in the hallway, its rhythm was changing. It was slowing down, stretching out, matching the heavy, sluggish beat of my own heart. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the house shifting, the wood groaning under the weight of its own history. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, but there was no signal, just a dead, gray screen. I felt watched, not by a person, but by the room itself. The taxidermy deer above the fireplace. Its glass eyes seemed to have a wet, human sheen in the dim light. I could have sworn its head had tilted a fraction of an inch to the left since I'd sat down. It was that uncanny valley sensation again. The feeling that everything around me was a clever imitation of a home, but underneath the wallpaper, something was very, very wrong. Then the hunger hit, a sharp, hollow ache in my stomach that felt almost desperate. I'd ordered a pizza from a place called Mama's about 40 minutes ago, the only place willing to drive this far into the trees. When the headlights finally splashed across the den walls, I felt a surge of relief so strong I almost cried. I ran to the door, but before I could even reach for the handle, the doorbell rang, a single, mournful chime. I opened it to find a delivery kid, maybe 20, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. His face was pale, his eyes darting toward the dark windows of the second floor. He didn't even ask for the money. He just shoved the box into my hands, his fingers trembling, and whispered, "You should leave, man. Just leave." Before sprinting back to his car, he peeled out of the gravel driveway so fast his tires spat stones against the porch. I should have listened. I really should have listened. I took the pizza to the kitchen. The white tiles were so bright, they hurt my eyes. Sterile, cold, and perfectly clean. I ate 3 slices. They tasted wrong, metallic, like licking a copper wire. Within 10 minutes, the world started to tilt. My head felt like it was being stuffed with cotton, and my limbs, they were turning into lead. My arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. I tried to stand up, my knees buckling, my vision blurring into a dizzying swirl of white and black. I slumped against the counter, gasping for air that felt thick, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. My eyes landed on a calendar pinned next to the industrial-sized fridge. There was a massive red circle around tonight's date. Inside it, written in that same elegant, jagged script I'd seen on the flyer, were 5 words that turned my boiling blood to ice. The lunar eclipse. The vessel is ready. Panic finally cut through the drug's fog, a cold spike of adrenaline that forced me to my feet. I bolted for the front door, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I grabbed the brass handle and twisted with every ounce of strength I had left. Nothing. It didn't even budge. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. I threw my shoulder against the oak. Thud. It was like hitting a mountain. I ran to the parlor windows, tearing back the heavy velvet drapes, desperate for a way out. I reached for the latch, but my hand hit something cold, something hard. Iron bars, thick black security bars, had been bolted into the exterior frames. I hadn't seen them when I arrived, or maybe I just hadn't wanted to see them. I moved from window to window, pulling back curtains, only to find the same cold iron. The house wasn't just a remote Victorian. It was a cage, and I was the only thing trapped inside. Then I heard it from the floor above, directly over the kitchen. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Something was moving in the attic. Something heavy. Something that was finally finished waiting. I stood at the base of the staircase, my hand trembling so hard against the mahogany banister that I could hear my fingernails clicking against the wood like a frantic telegraph. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The sound wasn't coming from the attic anymore. It was on the second floor landing. It sounded heavy, wet, like someone was dragging a carpet soaked in lead across the floorboards. I looked up into the throat of the house, and the shadows seemed to be coiling, dripping down the walls like black ink. My vision was tunneling now, the edges of my sight turning into a jagged, static-filled blackness. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. The drug, whatever they'd put in that pizza, it was stripping away my ability to think, leaving nothing but the raw, screaming instinct of a trapped animal. I had to hide. I couldn't stay in the open foyer. The taxidermy heads were watching me, their glass eyes reflecting a light that shouldn't have been there. I forced my leaden legs to move, crawling more than walking, pulling myself up the first 3 steps. The air changed as I ascended. It didn't smell like beeswax or lavender anymore. It smelled metallic, raw, like a butcher's shop, left out in the sun. And then I saw it. A mirror hung at the turn of the staircase, a heavy, ornate thing with a tarnished silver frame. I caught a glimpse of my own reflection, and I nearly choked. My face, it didn't look right. My eyes seemed to be shifted just a few millimeters too high. My mouth looked too wide. My skin had a gray, waxy sheen. It was the Thatcher effect. My brain was misfiring, unable to process the image of my own features. I looked like an imitation of a human. I looked like a monster. I looked away, my stomach heaving, and continued to crawl. The mother, Mrs. Ullman, had mentioned. I could see her shadow now. It was stretched across the floral wallpaper of the upper hall, a long distorted silhouette that didn't look like an old woman at all. It was too tall. Its limbs were too long, too thin, ending in shapes that looked more like hooks than hands. It stopped at the edge of the stairs. I froze, pressing my face into the moth-eaten carpet, praying the shadows would swallow me whole. I could hear it breathing, not a human breath. It was a wet, rattling whistle, like air being pushed through a punctured lung. Wah. Iss. Wah. Iss. And then a new sound sliced through the dark. Headlights. I didn't see them. I felt them. A sudden, violent flash of white light cut through the stained glass window above the front door, painting a kaleidoscopic pattern of blood red and sickly yellow across the foyer. The gravel outside began to crunch under heavy tires. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The front door, the door I'd thrown my body against just minutes ago, gave a sharp mechanical click. Leo, Mr. Ullman's voice drifted up from the foyer. It was louder now, resonant. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. The moon is almost gone, Leo. It's time to stop playing. It's time to fulfill your purpose. I tried to pull myself further into the dark, but my strength was gone. I was caught between the thing at the top of the stairs and the family waiting at the bottom. Part 5. The Throat of the House. Narration, style, visceral, suffocating, and punctuated by the rhythm of a panic attack. The slide was narrow, impossibly narrow, a vertical coffin of rough-hewn oak and century-old dust that seemed to squeeze the very breath from my lungs as I fell. I didn't tumble so much as glide, my numb, leaden body scraping against the wood. I should have felt the splinters tearing through my flannel shirt. I should have felt the heat of the friction against my skin. But there was nothing, just a cold, disconnected sliding sensation, like I was a piece of meat being dropped down a chute. I hit the bottom with a sickening, muffled thud, landing in a pile of something soft, damp, and smelling of deep, ancient earth. I lay there in the absolute blackness, gasping for air that felt like it was filled with powdered bone. My heart was a frantic, erratic thing, thumping against the floorboards of my chest like a bird trapped in a cage. Thump, 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 thump. I tried to move my hand to find some purchase in the dark, but my fingers felt like they were miles away, like they belonged to someone else entirely. When I finally managed to lift my hand into a sliver of light leaking through the floorboards above, I almost screamed. The Thatcher effect was worse now, much worse. In the flickering rhythmic light, my hand didn't look like a hand. The knuckles seemed to be on the wrong side of the fingers. The skin was a bruised, translucent violet, and the nails looked long, sharp, and jagged. My brain was screaming that this was wrong, that I was looking at a monster's limb, but I could feel the phantom sensation of my own thumb twitching. I wasn't just losing my mind. I was losing my shape. I was becoming the vessel they kept talking about. Above me, the house was alive with a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was a low, vibrating hum, a collection that seemed to be coming from the very walls, the cultists, the guests. They were chanting. It was a language that felt jagged, like the words were designed to tear at the throat of whoever spoke them. And through that drone, I heard the clicking. Click, click, click. The mother, she was right above me. I could see the tip of one of those long yellowed nails poking through a gap in the floorboards, testing the wood, searching for the seam of the hatch I'd just vanished through. Then a face appeared. Not hers. Mr. Ullman knelt on the floor above, staring down through the cracks. The light from the black candles behind him cast his shadow over me, and for a second the uncanny valley hit me with the force of a physical blow. His face. It wasn't the smooth, cultured mask from the foyer. The drug was making the shadows dance, and his features seemed to be melting, sliding, his eyes becoming two bottomless black pits that stretched toward his ears. His smile was too wide, too many teeth, all of them sharp and needle-thin. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a sketch of a man drawn by someone who hated humanity. "We see you, Leo," he whispered, and his voice didn't come from his mouth. It resonated inside my own skull, a vibrating, oily pressure. "The earth is already claiming you. The cellar is the womb, and the eclipse is the birth. Don't struggle. The more you fight, the less room there is for him." I scrambled backward, my elbows digging into the damp earth, my breath coming in jagged, sobbing gulps. I turned, crawling blindly into the crawl space, my head hitting low-hanging beams that felt like ribs. The space was filled with things, old porcelain dolls with shattered faces, bundles of hair tied with black twine, and jars filled with a thick gray fluid that seemed to pulse in time with the chanting above. I reached a wall, cold, damp stone, and felt a draft. A heavy, iron-bound door was slightly ajar, leading deeper into the sub-basement. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming like a dying animal, and stumbled into a room that smelled of copper and ozone. In the center of the room, beneath a grate that looked directly up into the center of the foyer, stood a stone altar, and on that altar was a suit, my suit, a set of clothes that looked exactly like the ones I was wearing, but they were laid out like a body. And next to them, a bowl of dark, steaming liquid and a curved obsidian knife. The humming above stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing my ribs. "The shadow has touched the heart of the moon." Mrs. Ullman's voice drifted down, cold and final. "Bring the vessel to the stone." I heard the hatch above me tear open with a violent, splintering crack. The hatch didn't just open, it was ripped from the floorboards with a violent, splintering shriek of wood on wood. A flood of sickly, flickering blue light poured down from the kitchen above, cutting through the basement's stagnant air like a blade. I didn't wait to see who or what was looking down. I turned on my stomach, my numb, leaden limbs scraping against the cold, packed earth as I dragged myself deeper into the sub-basement. The air here was different. It was heavy, wet, and carried a cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. The smell of rotting peaches mixed with the sharp, acidic sting of formaldehyde. I crawled through a narrow stone archway, my shoulders brushing against walls that felt soft, like they were lined with damp velvet. I reached out a hand to steady myself, but instead of stone, my fingers sank into something cold and yielding. I pulled back, gasping, as a sliver of light from the grate above illuminated the wall. It wasn't velvet, it was clothes. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of jackets, flannel shirts, and hoodies were pinned to the stone, hanging like the discarded skins of insects. I reached up, my hand shaking so violently I could hear my teeth rattling, and touched a denim jacket. A wallet fell out of the pocket, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. I fanned it open with my clumsy, spider-like fingers. A student ID stared back at me, a boy, maybe 19, with a bright, easy smile and a shock of blonde hair. Caleb Miller, the card read. I looked at the next jacket, another ID, Marcus Thorne, then another. Ethan, Tyler, Sam. They were all young men. They all had that same look in their eyes, the look of someone who had seen a flyer for $500 and thought they'd found a way out of their debts. I wasn't the first sitter, and I wasn't the second. I was just the latest arrival in a long, silent line of vessels. I backed away, my head hitting a low-hanging wooden beam. Something fell from the ledge above me, landing in the dirt with a metallic clink. It was a small, silver picture frame. I picked it up, wiping away the grime with my sleeve, and looked at the photograph inside. It was the Ullmans. They were standing in front of this very house, but they looked younger, not by years, but by vitality. Their skin was glowing. Their eyes were bright, and their smiles were human. Standing between them was a young woman with long, dark hair and a face that radiated kindness. I looked closer, my breath hitching in my chest. The face. It was the same face as the mother upstairs, the same porcelain features, the same wide-set eyes, but in the photo, she wasn't a mask. She was alive. I realized then, with a soul-crushing horror, that the thing dragging its nails across the floorboards upstairs wasn't a mother at all. She was the first sitter, a girl who had come for the money and stayed to become a hollowed-out shell, a biological puppet kept alive by whatever rot lived in the foundation of this house. She wasn't an antagonist. She was a warning. Click, click, click. The sound was right behind me. I turned slowly, my heart stopping in my chest. The mother was crouching in the archway. In the dim blue light, the Thatcher effect turned her face into a landscape of nightmares. Her eyes seemed to be rotating in their sockets. Her mouth was a jagged, vertical slit that stretched from her nose to her chin. She wasn't looking at me with malice. She was looking at me with a profound, empty hunger. She tilted her head, her neck clicking with the sound of snapping dry kindling, and let out a low, vibrating whistle. Leo. The voice came from her throat, but it wasn't her voice. It was the layered, echoing drone of the cultists above. The transition is almost complete. Your skin is already beginning to feel like a stranger's, isn't it? Your memories, are they slipping? Do you remember your father's face? Or is it just a blur of gray ash? I tried to scream, but my tongue felt too large for my mouth. A thick, useless muscle that tasted of copper and earth. I scrambled backward, hitting the stone altar I'd seen earlier. The obsidian knife caught the light, gleaming with an oily, purple sheen. The robed figures began to descend the stairs now, their black silk garments hissing against the stone steps like a nest. Solomon led the way, his chest bare, his ritual scars glowing with a faint, rhythmic pulse that matched the flickering of the blue candles. He held a bowl of dark, steaming liquid, the same liquid that was currently systematically erasing who I was. "Don't fight the eclipse, Leo," he whispered, his eyes now entirely black, reflecting the void that was consuming the moon outside. The girl was a failure. She had too much spirit, too much left inside. But you are hollowed out by debt and desperation. You are the perfect house for a god. They surrounded the altar, their humming becoming a physical weight that pressed me down onto the cold, flat stone. I looked up through the iron grate, and the moon was gone. In its place was a blood-red ring, a devil's eye staring down into the cellar. Mr. Ullman raised the obsidian knife. Part 7, The Final Occupant. Narration style. Fading, ethereal, punctuated by gasps and the crushing weight of total psychological collapse. The stone of the altar was colder than the winter air outside, but I couldn't tell where the cold stone ended and my own skin began. I felt translucent, like a sketch of a human being that someone was slowly erasing with a heavy, smudge-filled thumb. I looked up through the iron grate, and the devil's eye moon stared back, a bleeding crimson ring that seemed to be pulsing in perfect time with the throbbing in my skull, my heart. It wasn't mine anymore. It was a heavy, mechanical hammer. Thud, 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 driving the last of my humanity into the dirt floor. The robed figures closed the circle. Their humming had reached a pitch that was no longer a sound. It was a vibration that felt like it was tearing my atoms apart. I could see the shadows on the walls dancing, stretching into shapes that defied geometry. Limbs that were too long, heads that tilted at impossible angles. It was the uncanny valley of the soul. Everything about my existence, my memories of campus, the smell of my dad's old truck, the taste of that cheap pizza, it was all being compressed, flattened, turned into a thin, gray ash that was being blown away by a wind I couldn't feel. Mr. Ullman leaned over me, his face, it was a shattered landscape of shifting features. One eye was where his mouth should be. His nose was a jagged, vertical slit. His skin was the color of a bruised plum. The Thatcher effect had finally won. I couldn't recognize a human face anymore. He was just a collection of terrifying parts, moving in a horrific, synchronized dance. He held the obsidian knife above my heart, the blade reflecting the blood-red light of the eclipse. "The space is cleared," he whispered, and his voice sounded like 1,000 dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. "The debt is paid, the vessel is empty, and the guest is at the door." He didn't stab me. Not at first. He traced the tip of the blade along my collarbone, and instead of pain, I felt an opening, like a zipper being pulled down my chest. I felt myself, the core of who Leo was, spilling out onto the cold stone like spilled ink. I tried to cry out, but my mouth was no longer under my control. I felt my jaw unhinge, stretching, wider than a human jaw should ever go. My tongue felt like a thick, dry root, and my teeth. I could feel them sharpening, grinding against each other with a sound like breaking glass. "Look at me, Leo." Mrs. Ullman's voice drifted in, but she was standing behind me. I could feel her cold, skeletal fingers tracing the outline of my eyes. "Don't look at the knife. Look at the moon. See the eye? It's looking for its new home. It's looking for a place to rest its weary, ancient sight." The mother, the porcelain-faced puppet, crawled onto the edge of the altar. She leaned over me, her mask-like face inches from mine. For a second, her black hollow eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of the girl from the photograph. She wasn't screaming. She was waiting for someone else to join her in the gallery of the hollowed. She tilted her head, click, and a single black tear fell from her eye, landing on my cheek. It felt like liquid fire. Mr. Ullman raised the knife for the final strike. "Now," he growled, the word vibrating through the stone and into my spine. The blade came down, not into my heart, but into the center of my forehead. I didn't die. I expanded. The world turned blood red. I felt a presence, something vast, something ancient, something that smelled of the beginning of the world and the end of time, pushing its way into the space where Leo used to be. It was like a hand sliding into a glove that was far too small. I felt my ribs crack as they moved to accommodate the new weight. I felt my eyes roll back into my head, and suddenly I wasn't looking through my eyes anymore. I was looking through the red ring of the moon. I saw the house from above. I saw the Ullmans kneeling around my body, their faces turned upward in ecstatic terror. I saw the mother collapse into a heap of discarded silk and porcelain, and then I felt the hand, the entity, the guest. It took hold of my vocal cords. My mouth opened and a sound came out that wasn't a scream. It was a roar that shook the very foundation of the house. It was a name that made the black kennels blow out and the iron bars on the windows rattle in their frames. Silence fell. The eclipse passed. The shadow slid off the moon, leaving it pale and indifferent once again. I stood up. My limbs felt different, longer, stronger. I looked down at the altar. There was a body there, a boy in a flannel shirt with a pale, empty face. He looked like someone I might have known once. A boy named Leo, who had $7.42 in his bank account. I stepped off the altar, my bare feet hitting the dirt with a heavy, purposeful thud. Mr. Ullman looked up at me. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was trembling. He pressed his forehead into the dirt, his voice shaking with a terrifying, primal awe. "Master," he whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I walked toward the stairs, my new eyes adjusting to the dark. I didn't care about the rent. I didn't care about the disappointment in my father's voice. I just wanted to see what the rest of the world looked like through the eyes of a god. There is a specific kind of madness that only exists on the interstate after 3 a.m. It's a quiet, rhythmic insanity that starts in the base of your skull and slowly works its way down your spine until your hands on the steering wheel don't feel like your hands anymore. They feel like tools, mechanical appendages attached to a machine that is hurtling through a dark, indifferent void. I had been in that state for 6 hours. The road was no longer a path. It was a loop, a glitching animation of black asphalt, white lines, and the occasional green reflective sign that blurred past like a ghost. I was somewhere in the middle of the country, in that vast empty space where the map becomes a suggestion and the cell service dies a slow, agonizing death. My world had shrunk to the size of my cabin. The dashboard lights, a dim, sickly amber, were the only sun I knew. They cast a pale glow over the empty passenger seat, where a layer of dust had settled over a crumpled map I no longer knew how to read. I was driving away from the fire. That was the only thing I knew for certain. Every mile I put between myself and that scorched plot of land in Ohio felt like a victory, but it was a hollow one. You can outrun a person, and you can outrun a law, but you can't outrun a smell. The scent of charred pine and melted plastic was baked into the fabric of my seats. It was in my hair. It was in the back of my throat, a metallic tang that tasted like failure. I had the windows down, letting the freezing plains air whip through the cabin, hoping the wind would scour the memory out of me. But the wind just roared, a mindless, hungry sound that seemed to mock the tiny engine of my sedan. I was reaching the limit. My eyes were playing tricks on me. The white lines weren't just lines anymore. They were teeth, snapping at the tires. The shadows of the overpasses looked like giant, thin-limbed creatures crouching over the road, waiting for me to pass beneath them so they could drop onto the roof. The exhaustion was a physical weight, a leaden blanket draped over my shoulders. I needed to sleep, but the thought of closing my eyes felt like a death sentence. In the dark, behind my eyelids, the fire was always waiting. I'd see the orange glow. I'd hear the crackle of the beams. I'd see the silhouette in the upstairs window, the one that didn't move. So I kept driving. I drove until the road began to feel like it was vibrating at a frequency I shouldn't be able to hear. A low, pulsing hum that matched the beat of my heart. Thump thrum, thump thrum. I started to wonder if I was still on the interstate at all. The cornfields had disappeared, replaced by a wall of absolute blackness. No trees. No fences, no distant farmhouse lights, just the road and the void. Then the glow appeared. It wasn't the warm, welcoming yellow of a rest stop or the harsh, flickering neon of a franchise gas station. It was a cold, surgical white. It started as a pinprick on the horizon, a tiny hole poked in the fabric of the night, and as I drew closer, it expanded with a terrifying speed. It didn't cast light like a lamp. It seemed to consume the darkness around it. The fog that had been clinging to the road evaporated as I hit the off-ramp. My car didn't just slow down. The very physics of motion seemed to change. The vibration of the engine, the rattle of the loose change in the cup holder, the whistle of the wind, it all stopped. It was as if I had driven into a vacuum. I looked at the speedometer. It said I was doing 60, but I felt like I was standing perfectly still. The off-ramp wasn't made of asphalt. It was a matte black composite, smooth as silk and cold as ice. I pulled into the lot, and the sheer scale of the place hit me. It was a cathedral of light. The canopy over the pumps was a vast, white plane of seamless steel, glowing from within. There were no lights hanging from it. The metal itself was the light. Beneath it sat the pumps, silver monoliths that looked like they had been carved from a single block of mercury. There were no hoses, no screens, no credit card slots, just pillars of perfection standing in a row like silent sentinels. I brought the car to a halt at pump 4. When I turned the key, the engine didn't sputter or cough. It simply ceased to exist. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a pressurized silence that made my ears pop and my head swim. I sat there for a long minute, my hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the store. The building was a box of glass and white light. It was so clean, it looked like a 3D model that hadn't been finished yet. No dirt, no scuffs, no signs of the world's friction. There was no brand name on the sign. No Shell, no Exxon, no Circle K. Just a single word, written in a font that felt too modern, too sharp, too deliberate. Station. I opened the door, and the air that rushed in didn't smell like the Nebraska plains. It didn't smell like the cold or the earth. It smelled like nothing. It was the scent of a clean room, of a laboratory, of a place where life was not allowed to leave a mark. I stepped out onto the matte black pavement. My boots made no sound. I looked down, expecting to see my shadow stretched out behind me by the glare of the canopy, but there was nothing. The light was coming from the ground. It was coming from the air. It was coming from the very molecules of the station. I was standing in a world without shadows, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt the fire in my chest start to go cold. The glass doors didn't slide open with the mechanical groan of a sensor-driven motor. They didn't swing on hinges. As I approached, the very substance of the glass seemed to vibrate, becoming a shimmering veil before simply parting. It was like stepping through a wall of cold water that didn't leave me wet. I crossed the threshold, and the transition was total. The air inside the station was pressurized, a heavy, sterile weight that pressed against my eardrums until they popped with a sharp, crystalline click. The temperature was a constant, indifferent 68 degrees. It wasn't cool. It was a total absence of thermal character. The interior was a cathedral of consumerism, stripped of its soul. The aisles were long, impossibly long. From the outside, the building looked like a standard convenience store, maybe 3,000 square feet. But inside, the rows of white shelving stretched back into a perspective that felt fraudulent. The floor was a grid of white tiles, so polished I could see my own terrified face looking back at me from beneath my boots. And the light, God, the light. It was everywhere. It didn't come from fixtures. The very air seemed to be phosphorescent, casting no shadows, leaving no corner for a secret to hide. It was a place where everything was visible, yet nothing felt real. I walked down aisle 1. The sign above it was a simple white board with a single word in black. Essentials. I expected bread, milk, maybe some motor oil. What I found was a nightmare of branding. Row after row of matte gray bags sat on the shelves, each one aligned to the millimeter. The labels were a flat, clinical font, crunch. I reached out, my hand trembling, and picked one up. It had no weight. It felt like I was holding a vacuum wrapped in plastic. There was no rustle of chips, no shifting of contents. When I squeezed it, the material didn't crinkle. It felt like soft, warm skin. I turned it over. There were no ingredients, no nutritional facts, just a single sentence on the back. For the hunger that remains when the body is forgotten. I put it back, my heart hammering against my ribs. My touch had left a faint smudge on the pristine gray bag, and as I watched, the material seemed to heal itself, the smudge fading away until the bag was perfect once again. I moved to the next section, stillness. This aisle was lined with glass bottles filled with a clear liquid. The labels didn't say water, they said still. I took a bottle from the shelf and the coldness of the glass was so intense it felt like a burn. I looked at the liquid inside. It didn't move. I shook the bottle harder and harder, but the fluid remained a solid, unmoving block of clarity. It wasn't frozen. It was just still. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the refrigerator door behind the bottles. I froze. The man looking back at me wasn't the haggard, broken traveler who had been driving for 6 hours. He didn't have the gray in his beard or the deep, hollow lines of grief around his eyes. He was 24. He was wearing the flannel shirt I had lost in the fire. He looked happy. He looked like he still believed the world was a safe place. I reached out to touch the glass, to touch him, but my fingers met only the cold, unyielding surface of the display. The reflection is always the hardest part to stalk, a voice said. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over a display of silver cans labeled fuel. Behind the counter stood a man who didn't belong in any world I knew. He was tall, impossibly, terrifyingly tall. His head was less than an inch from the ceiling, and his limbs were long and tapering, ending in fingers that looked like they had too many knuckles. He was wearing a suit of charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the store, making him look like a silhouette cut out of a photograph. His face was a masterpiece of the uncanny valley. His skin was too smooth, his eyes too symmetrical, his smile a fraction of a second too slow. He didn't look at me. He was using a pair of silver tweezers to adjust a single pack of gum on a tray. I just needed coffee, I stammered. My voice sounded small and ragged in that vast, silent hall. The man finally looked up. His eyes weren't eyes. They were two polished mirrors reflecting the endless aisles behind me. Coffee is for those who wish to wake up, Marcus, he said. His voice was a smooth, melodic drone that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my brain. But no one comes to the station to wake up. They come here because they are finally ready to sleep. He knew my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow. How do you know who I am? The clerk leaned forward, his long torso folding like a carpenter's roll. I am the inventory manager, Marcus, and you have been part of the incoming ledger for a very long time. 6 years, 3 months, and 12 days to be precise. Ever since the night the orange light turned your world to ash. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small crystal vial. It was empty, yet it seemed to have a gravitational pull, a weight that made the air around it warp. You've been driving across the country trying to find a road that doesn't lead back to the fire, but the road is a circle, Marcus, and every circle leads back here to the symmetry, to the stillness. I backed away, hitting the shelf of still bottles. They didn't rattle. They didn't fall. They remained perfectly, terrifyingly aligned. I want to leave, I whispered. The clerk's smile grew, revealing teeth that were far too numerous and far too white. Of course you do, but where would you go? Back to the interstate, back to the smell of the smoke and the sound of your brother's voice calling from the second floor? You can't leave the station, Marcus, because you brought the station with you. I'm just the one who helps you unpack. The crystal vial sat on the white marble counter like a trap. It was small, no larger than a finger, but it seemed to hold the density of a collapsed star. I stared into it, and for a moment, the sterile white light of the station vanished. I wasn't standing in a convenience store anymore. I was back on the sidewalk in Ohio. I could feel the heat on my face, a blistering, angry roar that made the skin of my forehead tighten. I could smell the melting shingles. I could hear the windows shattering, a sound like diamonds hitting concrete. And there, in the center of the vial's glass, was the window, the second-floor bedroom. I saw the curtain catch fire, a sudden bloom of orange, and for a split second, I saw a hand press against the glass. A small hand, my brother. "It's so heavy, isn't it?" The clerk's voice was a cold needle in my ear. He hadn't moved, yet he seemed to be looming over me from every direction at once. The weight of a single moment. It's been 6 years, and yet you carry that heat every second of every day. You drive to cool it down, but the air of the interstate only fans the flames. You are a furnace, Marcus, and you are burning yourself to ash. I looked up at him, my eyes stinging. "You can take it away, truly." "I don't just take it," the clerk whispered, his mirror eyes shimmering with a dull, silver hunger. "I refine it, I align it, I give it a place on a shelf where it can be beautiful, where it can be still, where it can never hurt you again. In the world outside, memories are jagged things. They cut. But here, they are geometry, they are inventory, they are perfect." He pushed the vial toward me. It slid across the marble without a sound. "Just uncork the glass, Marcus. Think of the fire, think of the heat, think of the hand on the window, and let it go. Give it to the station." My fingers touched the glass. It was cold, so cold it felt like it was drinking the warmth from my blood. I looked back at the doors, at the white void where the road used to be. I realized then that there was no back. There was no car waiting for me. There was no highway. There was only the choice between the fire and the stillness. And I was so tired of the fire. I pulled the cork. There was no sound, no dramatic rush of wind, just a sudden sharp scent of wood smoke that filled the room, followed by a terrifying, absolute silence. I felt a tugging behind my eyes, a sensation like a thread being pulled from a piece of silk. I saw it leave me, a thin, coiling mist of deep, bruised orange. It poured out of my mouth, out of my tear ducts, out of the pores of my skin. It was the color of the sunset through a house fire. It was the sound of the sirens I had tried to ignore. It was the what if that had been my only companion for 1,000 nights. I watched it spiral into the vial. The glass began to glow, a pulsing, rhythmic orange that illuminated the clerk's pale, poreless face. He watched the mist with an expression of pure, religious ecstasy. As the last of the smoke left my body, I felt a sensation I hadn't known in years. I felt light, but it wasn't the lightness of relief. It was the lightness of an empty box. I looked down at my hands. They were pale. The scars I'd gotten from the heat of that night were fading, smoothing over into the same perfect, vellum-like skin as the clerk. I tried to remember my brother's name. I knew I had one. I knew there was a boy in a window. But the image was gone. I could remember the fact of the fire, but I couldn't feel the heat. It was like reading a sentence in a book I didn't care about. The boy was just a shape. The fire was just a color. Transaction complete, the clerk said. He picked up the vial, which was now a solid, glowing amber. He turned it over, checking the alignment, and then walked to aisle 9. I followed him, my movements becoming fluid, mechanical. I didn't feel the floor beneath my feet. I didn't feel the air in my lungs. I watched as he placed the vial on a shelf between a silver tin labeled Neglect and a matte black box labeled Cowardice. He moved it a fraction of an inch to the left, then a hair to the right until it was perfectly centered. Where do I go now? I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded like the hum of the neon lights. It sounded like the pressurized air. The clerk turned to me. He wasn't a predator anymore. He was a supervisor. You are home, Marcus. You are the newest addition to the collection. Aisle 9, Section B. Your label is the unanswered cry. It's a premium grade. Very high energy. I looked at the shelf. There was an empty space, exactly my width, exactly my height. I walked toward it. It felt right. It felt inevitable. I stepped onto the ledge, turning my back to the wall, facing the endless, symmetrical aisles of the station. My body began to stiffen. I felt the matte black pavement's texture spreading up my legs, turning my skin into the same weightless, silent material as the crunch bags. My eyes fixed on a point on the opposite wall. A single, glowing tile. I felt my thoughts begin to align. My memories, my fears, my very name. They were all being processed, categorized, and filed away into the white light. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a product. I was a proof of concept. I was part of the perfection. The clerk walked back to the counter and began to polish the marble with a white silk cloth. He didn't look back at me. He didn't need to. I was where I belonged. Suddenly, the silence was broken. Cling. The silver chime of the front door. I couldn't move my head, but I could see the reflection in the glass of the refrigerator across from me. A pair of headlights cut through the white void outside. A car, exhausted, dirty, and smelling of the real world, pulled up to pump 4. A woman stepped out. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She looked like she was carrying a mountain on her back. She looked at the sign that said, Station, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her to run, to get back in the car, to embrace the noise and the fire and the messy, beautiful pain of being alive, but I couldn't. My mouth was a perfect, silent line. My chin was aligned to the horizon. My label was facing forward. The clerk looked up from his counter, his mirror eyes reflecting the new arrival. Welcome, he whispered, his voice carrying through the store like a cool breeze. Can I help you find what you're looking for? The woman stepped into the light, and I watched her shadow disappear. I felt a thrill of cold, mechanical satisfaction. The station was almost full, and a full station is a perfect one.
The interstate is a messy, inefficient thing. To the humans crawling across it, it's a vein of asphalt and hope. To me, it is a sieve. It is a massive continent-spanning trap designed to catch the ones who have become too heavy to keep moving. Most travelers are light. They are full of trivialities, small joys, and shallow anxieties that evaporate in the sun. They pass through the sieve without a trace. But every so often, the sensors twitch. A frequency appears on the horizon, a low, oscillating hum of high-grade agony. It is the sound of a soul that has stopped looking forward and has begun to turn inward, collapsing under the weight of a single, unchangeable moment. Tonight, the hum was exquisite. I felt him 50 miles away. Marcus, a name that will soon be a serial number. His vibration was a deep, resonant orange, the color of oxidized iron and wood smoke. It was a fire-free frequency. We watched his progress on the primary monitors, his tiny sedan a flickering spark against the velvet black of the Nebraska void. He was driving at 80 miles per hour, but in the geography that matters, he was standing perfectly still. He was trapped in the loop of 6 years ago, and the harder he pressed the accelerator, the deeper he sank into our territory. People think the station is a building. It isn't. It is a localized rupture in the fabric of their real. We don't build it. We manifest it where the noise of a traveler reaches its peak. When Marcus hit the psychological breaking point, when his exhaustion finally stripped away his defenses, I reached out and pulled the exit ramp toward him. The transition is my favorite part. I watched as his reality began to fray. I tuned the atmosphere to total zero, stripping the sound of the wind and the smell of the earth from his senses. To Marcus, it felt like a malfunction of physics. To me, it was simply clearing the workspace. You cannot perform a clean harvest in a room full of static. I replaced the asphalt with our matte black composite, a non-reflective sound-dampening substrate that prepares the subject for the stillness. When he pulled up to pump 4, I began the initialization. I don't need to charge him for gas. His presence alone was refueling the canopy's light. The mere proximity of his guilt was enough to power the station for 3 cycles. I stood behind the counter and adjusted my cuffs. My skin, a synthetic poreless vellum, shimmered under the phosphorescence. I checked the ledger. Everything was in order. Aisle 9 was empty, the shelf was dusted, the vacuum was primed. I heard his car door close, a muffled, pathetic sound in the pressurized silence I had created. He was stepping out of his life and into my inventory. He didn't know it yet, but he had already stopped being a person. He was now a prospect, and by the time the sun didn't rise, he would be a product. I picked up my tweezers and adjusted a pack of gum. 1 millimeter. Symmetry is the only law here. And become very, very simple. The doors parted and the noise entered. Humans are incredibly loud even when they are silent. They are walking, breathing storms of biological failure. As Marcus crossed the threshold, he brought a cacophony with him. The frantic, uneven thumping of a heart pushed to its limit. The wet, ragged sound of lungs struggling against the pressurized purity of my air, and that persistent, rotting scent of charred pine that clung to his psyche, like a parasite. To him, the station was a sanctuary of light. To me, he was a smudge on a clean lens. He was a disorganized pile of data that needed to be pruned, polished, and filed. I watched him from the periphery, my movements so precise, they appeared motionless. I let him wander. A cornered animal needs to feel like it's found a burrow before you can truly study it. I watched him drift down aisle 1. It is always a fascinating study in primitive psychology to see them interact with the inventory. They look for brands, familiar, colorful anchors to ground them in a reality that has already abandoned them. They crave the familiar lie of corporate comfort. He stopped at a shelf of crunch. I watched his thumb press into the synthetic matte gray membrane of the bag. He expected the resistance of trapped air and fried starch. Instead, he felt the pliancy of the void. He didn't realize that the bag wasn't holding food. It was holding the hunger of a woman from 1994, a soul who had starved herself in a cold apartment waiting for a phone call that never came. We've refined her desperation into a stable, shelf-ready form. It's one of our best sellers in the long-term regret category. It has a specific vibration, a low, hollow thrumming that satisfies a hunger Marcus hasn't even realized he has yet. He put it back, and I watched the shelf heal. My inventory does not tolerate fingerprints. Then he moved to aisle 4. Stillness. I saw the exact moment the softening phase took hold.